I think this is just the perfect time to hear from Greg, who most of you know has had a long and, shall we say, unique history with U.S.-Cuba relations, from being a foreign policy aide to Senator Kennedy, to his years working for Madeleine Albright in the Clinton administration, and in his term during the Obama administration. He has, how do you say, a very important voice, I think, as well as a very personal voice. And when you're standing between yourself and somebody smarter, you shut up. So I'm going to turn it over to Greg.
Thank you for that introduction. The topic here is negotiating with Cuba, and you've just heard about, from Peter, the history of secret diplomacy, and I'm advertised as talking about recent initiatives and future prospects. And I'd like to change my topic because, and then you can draw your conclusions from what I say, but I'd like to change my topic to an advertising slogan, which is "Just Do It." And that title is not what appears in the program, which is recent initiatives and future prospects. But the gist of my remarks today is perhaps very different from the thrust of this afternoon's argument and what we've just heard from one of the most knowledgeable people about U.S.-Cuban relations, which seems to be, look, 8 presidents have talked with the government of Cuba one way or another for almost 50 years, and what have we got to show for it? And I just want to say I have nothing against entering into negotiations with Cuba. It's always good to talk, even with adversaries. I remember that famous debate between Hillary Clinton and Senator Obama. And I supported Senator Obama, and we stuck with this position, even though there was a good deal of pressure to change that position, when Senator Obama in the debate, and you referred to it, I think, Peter, said that he would, in fact, deal with and negotiate with our adversaries in the first presidential debate in 2008, and was criticized for it by Senator Clinton. But I don't believe that negotiating a change in our policy towards Cuba is the way to do it. I think we should just do it. We should change our attitude, our policy, and our posture towards Cuba unilaterally. We should do this on our own without expecting or trying to extract any concessions from the Cubans. That may come in the future, but we have an interest in doing this before they do. I believe that the president should change U.S. policy towards Cuba because it's in our interest to do it. And the idea of negotiating with the Cubans to secure some kind of quid pro quo from them in exchange for us adopting a policy that is clearly in our national self-interest is wrong-headed. We should change our policy because after 50 years, we should recognize that it has failed us and we need a completely new approach. And to give the Cubans any negotiating leverage over what our new policy should be or when it should kick in is, in my opinion, short-sighted and self-destructive. The Cubans act in their own self-interest all the time, and so should we. Now, there's another reason why I changed the topic. I know of no recent initiatives other than various efforts from outside the executive branch and from members of Congress aimed at persuading the White House to change course. The White House has been, by and large, and the State Department has been, by and large, silent about what its attitude is towards Cuba in terms of change. But each and every U.S. official, whether he's from the White House or the State Department, who talks about the issue of Cuba in private these days, seems to accept the need for change in theory and says that U.S. policy towards Cuba is being constantly reviewed at the highest levels. They say, be of good cheer, rest assured, the U.S. government is all over this issue, change is coming. I hope that is true. I have no inside knowledge or information that it is true. I don't know whether we have had or are planning to have talks with the Cubans on this subject, or whether we are even seriously thinking about a meaningful change in direction with respect to U.S. policy towards Cuba. My best guess is that if the administration wants to change policy and does not let distractions derail the effort, it will happen in 2015, between November 2014 and April 2015, probably before the Summit of the Americas. I will also say this: if President Obama completes 8 years in office without taking action to change the direction of U.S. policy towards Cuba, this failure, I think, will do serious damage to his legacy and will certainly raise further questions about his slogan in 2008 that he stood as the candidate for change you can believe in. I'd like to tell you what advice I would give the president now as to what we should be doing and why. But before I do that, let me describe very briefly my involvement with the Cubans over the years, some of it public, some of it very private. And it begins in 1986 when I was working for Senator Edward M. Kennedy. In 1986, we learned that even after the passage of 25 years, there was one officer from the Bay of Pigs Brigade still in jail in Cuba. Senator Kennedy decided to write a personal letter to President Castro asking him on the 25th anniversary of the invasion to close this chapter in our history and please release this one last officer from the brigade. We delivered the letter to the Cuban intersection in Washington. It took about 3 months for an answer to be received, but it came back through the intersection that the government of Cuba was responding to Senator Kennedy's request, and it decided to release Ricardo Montero Duque, who had been an officer in the brigade. Cuba wanted it known that it was making this decision for Senator Kennedy and not for any Free Cuba organization in Miami. So they insisted that Senator Kennedy would have to come down to Cuba himself to pick up Ricardo Montero Duque. But Senator Kennedy had no plans to go to Cuba, and the Cubans agreed to turn Montero Duque over to Senator Kennedy's representative. That was me. We coordinated this trip with the State Department. We met with Secretary of State Schultz on 2 different occasions to discuss the trip. I went to Cuba on a Friday night, met with Montero Duque at the Combinado de Este prison on Saturday morning, and told him that he would be coming back to the United States with me on Sunday. The next afternoon, the authorities brought Montero Duque to the airport, and we flew to Miami in a small private plane. When I met with Montero Duque in the prison, he did not know, no warning had been given to him that he was about to be released, and it was an emotional moment for him when I told him that we were going back to the United States. At that time, he told me that he was not the last soldier of the Bay of Pigs Brigade. There was one other individual from the brigade who was still in jail, and he gave me his name. His name was Ramon Conte Hernandez. That afternoon, I went to the U.S. intersection in Cuba, talked to Senator Kennedy on the phone, and he decided to make a second request. He drafted a letter to President Castro, had it delivered that afternoon to the Cuban intersection, faxed it to me in the intersection, and I had it with me and delivered it to the highest authorities in the Cuban government that night, requesting the release of Ramon Conte Hernandez. Now, 2 months later, Ramon Conte Hernandez was not released at that moment. We went back that Sunday afternoon, Montero Duque and I, to Miami. Were met by Jeb Bush on the ground. But we were told 2 months later that the government of Cuba would once again grant Senator Kennedy's request, and I went back to Cuba a second time, met with Ramon Conte Hernandez in his prison, and flew back to the United States in the company of the last soldier from the Bay of Pigs Brigade who was still in prison in Cuba. That was my first involvement. It was rather extensive and intense, and I had a series of meetings with government officials in Havana at all hours of the night. May I just say that no one sleeps in Havana. That's when you get your work done. during that period of time, the Secretary of State used us to carry messages to the government of Cuba in an effort to reopen the consular agreement. When the United States launched Radio Marti, the Cuban government repudiated the existing consular agreement. When I met with Senator Kennedy and with Secretary of State Schultz in 1986, he asked me to carry a private letter to the government of Cuba proposing that representatives of the two governments meet to discuss reinstating the consular agreement. That happened. I delivered the letter, met with government officials to discuss it, and shortly thereafter, secret discussions began between the two governments. Finally, my experience with Cuba was not over because in the year 2000, I represented Elian Gonzalez's father, Juan Miguel Gonzalez, in an effort to regain custody of his son, which caused me in the course of that representation to travel to Cuba on a number of different occasions to meet with my client and government officials to discuss what was happening in the United States with respect to the case, what was happening in the courts, in the Department of Justice, in the White House, in the State Department, and to give guidance to the first time, I think, in recent history, at least in the last 50 years, where the United States government and the Cuban government were actually working together in a coordinated fashion as best possible on the same side of an issue. I am not an expert on U.S.-Cuba relations. I'm a lawyer. I do not pretend to know or understand all the history that exists between us. I do know one thing, that there's no other country in the world, except perhaps Panama, that follows American Major League Baseball with such passion, with such a detailed knowledge about what is going on. Let me make 4 points about the situation today that will relate to my final comments. Point 1, Cuba in the year 2014 poses no serious threat to United States interests anywhere in the world. Today, there's no serious ideological, political, economic, or military threat to the United States or our allies. And in truth, our two governments, despite their ideological hostility, are in agreement on many critical geopolitical questions and have come together on those questions. Both governments oppose terrorism. Both pursue aggressive policies against narco-trafficking. Both support peace negotiations between the Colombian government and the FARC. Both support sensible measures aimed at environmental protection. Cuba is no longer in the business, the active business of fomenting revolution beyond its borders in the region or elsewhere. Now, we still have fundamental differences with the Cubans about how they treat their citizens, but that doesn't distinguish Cuba from many other countries with whom we have diplomatic relations. Point 2, change is coming to Cuba. The Castros will be gone within the next 5 or 10 years. The Castros live long lives, but it's a certainty that their lives will one day end. This is as close to an actuarial fact as any fact exists today. Fidel is 88 years old. Raul is 83 years old. And as the Castro brothers vanish from the scene, there will be a transition. The change that has already begun will accelerate, and the domestic status quo inside Cuba will change one way or another. It is a mistake, in my view, to view Cuban leadership today as being monolithic. As the Castro brothers' influence declines, there will be a competition among various stakeholders in Cuba as to who will decide the nation's future. Many from within the state government, the state power elite, will seek to fill the vacuum. One thing I think is certain, that the Cuban security establishment, the military, the secret police, the intelligence community, and law enforcement will try to assert itself. To protect themselves and their future status inside of Cuba, these agencies will claim to be the true protectors of the revolution, and they will use their power and position to overcome opposition. They will seek to control the future course of this nation. Whether they succeed is the single most important question for Cuba's future and Cuba's role in this hemisphere. That's point 2. Point 3, the United States has an interest in encouraging and influencing and shaping to the extent it can the change that is coming in Cuba. It is in the national security interests of the United States to pursue a policy that is, in fact, effective in promoting change in the way Cuba governs itself. To continue the embargo and to continue supporting actions aimed at regime change will only strengthen the power of the Cuban security establishment as the transition goes forward. The U.S. ability to influence change inside Cuba after the Castros have left the scene is, in fact, at the moment limited. But continuing the same approach that we've adopted over the last 50 years will marginalize our ability to have any impact or to influence events at all, and it will reduce, if not eliminate, the U.S. capacity to be a positive force for change and a factor in post-Castro Cuba. Opening diplomatic relations with Cuba, eliminating restrictions on diplomats' travel, lifting the travel ban on American citizens, and ending the economic embargo will increase the ability of the United States to influence events in Cuba during these coming years. Point 4. Today, American political leaders can support a different approach to Cuba without paying a heavy political price. The current policy towards Cuba has, after 50 years, proven to be an utter and a complete failure. The American public, including a majority of the Cuban American community, now recognizes and believes our policy in the past to be a failure. This is true in the Cuban American community in Florida, as well as Cuban American voters and elites. No senior member of the Obama administration believes that the embargo has been or ever will be effective in promoting democratic change in Cuba. No senior member of the Obama administration will publicly defend the embargo, or at least I haven't seen them do it. Whether it is the Secretary of State or the Secretary of Defense or the President or the Vice President, each and every one of these in the course of their political histories has publicly and openly spoken against the embargo, either privately or publicly. But they did so before they took office, before they occupied their current positions. Since he first came into electoral politics, President Obama, in particular, has always been clear about his opposition to the Cuban embargo. When he was elected president, the American people and the executive branch fully expected that U.S. policy towards Cuba to change during his term of office. Simply put, the political cost to politicians, whether they are Republicans, and there are many, or Democrats who support change in U.S. policy towards Cuba, is no longer what it once was. So I make an argument for unilateral action. President Obama said that one of the organizing principles with respect to U.S. foreign policy is don't do stupid stuff. And if what we're doing isn't working, we ought to change it. With respect to U.S. policy towards Cuba over the past 6 years, I submit that he has violated this fundamental principle. We should change our approach to Cuba, not because we want to be nice to Cuba, but because it's in the national security interests of the United States to do so. Not because our friends in Latin America want us to do so, not because our friends in Europe want us to do so, not because the General Assembly of the United Nations wants us to do this almost unanimously. The last vote of the United Nations on this issue, we had Israel with us and nobody else. We'd lost, I think we lost the Palau, right. And let me just say, I think we should change our approach to Cuba, whether or not whether Cuba releases Alan Gross or not, whether or not Cuba provides more political space to dissidents, whether or not Cuba adopts measures aimed at liberalizing the Cuban economy. The Cubans should not have control over our policy. We should pursue a policy that's in our self-interest. We should not condition our willingness to adopt a smarter and better policy towards Cuba on Cuba's willingness to make concessions to us, on human rights or Alan Gross or economic reform or anything else, because that puts our policy in the hands of Cuban government officials and political leaders who always pursue their own interests, don't care about U.S. interests, have never offered to make, as far as I can tell, significant concessions to the U.S. in exchange for lifting the travel ban or the embargo, and have frequently taken actions at the 11th hour that have frustrated U.S. intentions to change course. So we should not continue to empower Cuba with the ability to prevent us from pursuing our own best interests. How to do it. As an example of how to do it, both with respect to the diplomacy as well as to managing domestic political opinion, President Obama should take a moment to look at the way President Roosevelt initiated recognition of the government of the Soviet Union in 1934, and the way President Nixon took action to the opening in China. I think that was in 1972, when Nixon orchestrated the change in U.S. policy towards China. We have done this before on 2 occasions. He should sign a private letter to the president of Cuba informing him of the U.S. government's decision to restore diplomatic relations with Cuba, to lift the travel ban, and to end the embargo. He should use an experienced American diplomat to carry the message personally and privately to the president of Cuba. And in his letter, the president should invite the Cubans to meet for the purpose of discussing ways of accomplishing this change of policy in ways that will minimize the possibility of misunderstanding and maximize the possibility of improving relations between our 2 countries. If the Cubans wish to discuss the matter with the special envoy from the United States, that diplomat should be prepared to engage in such discussions. I think it has to happen between November of this year and April of next year. Above all, it will be necessary to avoid distractions. The Cubans will predictably seek to extract concessions from the United States, for example, to condition Cuba's agreement to the U.S. proposed change in U.S. policy on the U.S. doing certain things, such as releasing the remaining members of the Cuban Five. But it is counterintuitive for Cuba to condition changes in U.S. policy on the United States making concessions to Cuba. Any discussion with the Cubans should begin with the U.S. being clear that the era of the embargo is over, the travel ban is terminated, the consulates and the embassies will be opened, and the diplomats will return to duty. To change our approach to Cuba, we do not need a Cuban blessing. Do we forget Alan Gross? Of course not. I believe this approach will speed his release. Do we ignore Cuba's abuse of human rights? Of course not. I believe that this change will allow Americans to engage with Cubans more frequently and encourage greater flexibility on the part of Cuban decision makers. That would be a negotiation worth having. Any questions? Say what?
I said, folks can hire you as their private counsel through Skadden Arps after the break.
I have a 17-page memo here from our lawyers on what Obama could do by himself without Congress to improve or make at least gestures to the Cuban government to engage and do some of the things you're talking about. The one big stumbling block to ending the embargo is, of course, Congress. So what would your approach be to the Congress?
Good lawyers. I think there are always, I'm not familiar with the actual language of the statute that incorporates the embargo into, codifies the embargo into U.S. law. But my feeling is that there's always an escape clause for a president who acts in the national security interest of the United States. And if the president makes a finding that it is in the national security interest of the United States to permit certain economic transactions from occurring, or he sets up, well, already, by the way, may I say that the OFAC has liberalized travel, activities that don't constitute trade but come close to it. I mean, the American Chamber of Commerce just went to Cuba. What was that all about, other than getting ready for this to happen? And that was with a license from OFAC. So I think it's a matter of, by the way, if there was a vote that was permitted on this issue in the Congress, I think probably the administration would win the vote.
I have a related question. I mean, we've talked a lot about how the political costs for anyone who does something on Cuba, whether it's the president or someone in Congress, have changed because of the demographics and the political views that have changed in Miami mostly. But it seems that it is also Congress that, you know, that we've heard. I think Menendez has made threats, or, you know, whatever the case may be. It's clear that there are costs with Congress for doing this sort of thing. So, do you have any knowledge of what they are most concerned about? What are they afraid of would happen if they just did this? What are they afraid Menendez or Ileana or one of these people would do?
First of all, let me say that I have no inside information as to what is going on in the White House or the State Department on this issue, so that I'm not asking for you to...
Right, just I generally, like...
The other thing that I don't know is what's going on in the leadership of the Republicans in the Congress of the United States. I can't tell you that either. I can tell you, I think generally that there's a willingness among some Republicans that are quite outspoken to lift the embargo. The senator from Arizona is one. And he's been outspoken. He's paid no cost whatsoever politically, as I can tell. And there are others that would probably join him if the issue came up. But I don't blame Congress for keeping the status quo. I blame the White House and the administration for not willing. They've got a lot on their plate. I'm not going to be critical of that. But I think their last window is the next 5 or 6 months. And if they don't do it in the next 5 or 6 months, it is a lost opportunity. And I haven't done the analysis of the statute, but I bet you there is a lot that can be done unilaterally by executive action, calling for national security explanations for doing it that would allow him to take action, perhaps not lift the body of the statute of that legislation, but would certainly be able to change the relationship.
But is it just appointments? I mean, is it the concern, like, generally speaking, is the hesitation, like, how do you explain the hesitation? You know, it all sounds very logical in this conversation we're having here, but clearly they're hesitating. It's not just because they're busy with other things. What are they afraid of? I mean, you know.
Well, Florida still remains a very, very important political prize. There is a very hotly contested contest for the governorship between Charlie Crist and the incumbent. So I would bet that there's been a cold, calculated political judgment. Let's get beyond adverse political consequences that can come from taking these steps. My message here is that he should take the steps, that he shouldn't negotiate with Congress, he shouldn't negotiate with the Cubans. It's self-evidently in the interest of the United States government and the people of the United States for this policy to change. And it's irresponsible to allow it to go forward. And I would take on anybody to argue that this embargo has worked and it's in the interest of the United States, it's influenced policy towards Cuba. I don't think it has influenced policy of the Cubans.
I'm just wondering if somebody can clarify, lifting the embargo is one thing that would take congressional approval, but normalizing relations, isn't that an act of the president? Can somebody clarify that?
Yes.
You can recognize, he can send an ambassador, he can recognize an ambassador from them, and that's what I'm proposing here, that he just do it. That's the phrase, just do it. If you can't do it now, it may not ever happen. By the way, he has no real serious opposition within the Democratic Party. Hillary Clinton has already come out in favor of normalizing relations. Whether she would do it or not, I don't know. But the time for the president to do it is between November after the elections and April before the summit in Panama.
What you're saying makes a lot of sense on the one hand, but at a moment when the House of Representatives was all Democrats, all in favor of ending the embargo, Chris Dodd, you had Jeff Flake, you had all these people talking out, and they never did anything. The Congress never acted, and there was never any movement. And I have a hard time visualizing them not trying to do something now with the change of the conversation.
I think there's a fallacy in your analysis. I think changes in American foreign policy, with one very important historical exception, never come from the Congress. That exception was South Africa. When in 1985, 86, over a presidential veto, both the House and the Senate voted to impose sanctions on South Africa, the apartheid government. Chris Dodd's position is clear on this issue, as is Jeff Flake's. He thinks the embargo makes no sense and it's self-destructive, not in our interests. Congress cannot change policy on its own, foreign policy. It has to have an executive that is prepared to do it.
What I was going to just say at the end is that what the Cubans complain about is that President Obama has not only not loosened, except for the travel and the money being sent, he's tightened all the banking rules, and it's made Cuba have a much more difficult time in international trade because of the fines they're imposing on all the banks around the world, et cetera, and has given the impression to the Cubans, as they put it, and to some of us who have to get money to run our media operations in Cuba, that it's much worse, much tighter, the embargo under him than it was under President Bush.
Well, there are people, you're looking at everybody has their little part of the body of the elephant to look at, and they may be absolutely right that for some reason OFAC is imposing more stringent standards on financial transactions. At the same time, OFAC is allowing Chamber of Commerce, agricultural interests, economic interests to go down there and identify counterparts. I mean, it looks to me as that what OFAC is doing in a broad spectrum of areas economically is laying the groundwork for when the embargo comes up, the Americans can just go down there and know who their counterparts are. I'm not sure I could say that about everything, but you're probably right that in the financial community it's tighter than ever before. But that shows to me that it's a policy without coherence. As I said in my remarks, I don't think there's a single senior member of this administration, whether it's the Secretary of Defense or the Secretary of State or the President or the Vice President or the National Security Advisor, who in their heart of hearts believes the embargo is an effective policy. And we have Obama actually on videotape opposing the policy when he ran for public office. How are you?
I would just say that I was on the Brookings conference that wrote the paper for recommendations to Obama, which went to him, et cetera. And we identified dozens of areas where he could act unilaterally without Congress, things like remove Cuba from the list of terrorists, and on and on and on, ambassador appointments, just dozens of areas where there was executive action wiggle room, never mind Congress. But regarding Congress, the other opportunity that strikes me now is if you look today, Robert Menendez has an op-ed responding to the New York Times and Fidel's yesterday.
The big editorial.
Okay, and the point being is in the Senate, as far as I know, we have 3 Hispanic senators, and all of whom are of our Cuban derivation, Menendez, Rubio, and Cruz. And, but all of them have moved against immigration, but the way this could possibly move forward is an immigration issue. But in fact, we know that 25,000 people who entered illegally, but they came across the Florida Straits, far more than what had been apprehended at the Mexican border. And what I'm told is even within Miami circles, you have the old-timers who are really, really upset about wet foot, dry foot, because they're not political refugees, they're economic. And even Rubio privately said it's not right So one way that this actually logistically could go forward with such a recalcitrant Congress is on the immigration issue to get an even playing field, if you see what I'm saying. Of course, everything is post-midterm elections, and I have a good hunch that a lot of those pointers and Brookings and other, white papers are going to happen incrementally after the midterms. If you have any thoughts on
Could I just say that I do believe that the political price that the president pays now for lifting the embargo and changing policy is not nearly what it would have been earlier. I think if you reduce his opposition in the United States Senate to 3 senators.
He can't lift the embargo. The embargo is now codified since Helms-Burton. That's what happened with the shoot down. He is.
That was President Clinton's fault. What I'm saying is that there's many things he can do in the interest of national security, short of violating Helms-Burton, that allows him to essentially vitiate the embargo.
Okay.
And he might even get a vote in the Senate to do it. But my point is that the forest has changed. The forest has changed dramatically, I think, politically. For one reason, because the politics of the community in Miami and southern Florida has changed as well. So given the fact that there's change that's on the ground in the United States that liberates American public officials, I think it's possible now for President Obama, without paying a very high political price, if he shows leadership and resolve, to do what I suggested, to tell the Cuban authorities that he's going to, as best he can, lift the embargo unilaterally to the extent he can, and he wants to find out from them what their response is going to be and maybe negotiate. That's when you get progress on the question of other issues. But the Cubans should not have control over U.S. policy anymore.
Brian and then John, couple more questions.
Just a quick one. I must say, whenever the former, over here,
Where are you? Yeah, I can never tell where you are.
whenever the former White House counsel says, we'll just cite national security and come up with a reason, one might cringe when they hear that. But specifically, I mean,
It's been abused.
Yeah, you sort of flippantly said, well, on national security grounds, he can just do all these things. If you were advising him, what would be the national security reason to change a policy of 50 years? I mean, I'm not saying that.
It's in the national security interest of the United States of America that it have full diplomatic relations with the government of Cuba, that it does more damage to our national self-interest to maintain an embargo and to maintain a relationship that is self-defeating than it would be for us to go forward and try to build a new relationship. And the fact that the past policy is bankrupt is demonstrated by the history. Over and over and over again, we've done damage to our ability to solve problems, to make progress, and even though there have been delegations and private communications back and forth, the fact that the governments don't speak and that the governments don't work together does enormous damage to our self-interest as a nation.
John and then Orlando.
So I'm enjoying this tactical discussion about how our government is going to solve this problem. So in that spirit, I just wanted to suggest that one approach, I'm assuming that in the administration, this administration, they're having a similar discussion and they're trying to solve this problem. And they're probably looking at the same window that you're looking at. And they're looking at tactical solutions, and Congress is the biggest problem. So it occurs to me that one of the approaches, everything that you say is doable, but we're stuck on the Helms-Burton problem. It would seem to me that the administration that Obama could simply say, I can't change the embargo, but the embargo is wrong, and I call on Congress to get rid of it. That would shift the burden of this enormous fiasco of 50 years of failed policy onto Congress. I don't know whether it would get a vote, but I think that it would open the floodgates, and I don't know, just wondered what you thought about that as an alternative.
No, that's fine. I think Helms-Burton should be repealed. It was a bad piece of legislation at the time. I think it actually arguably is unconstitutional because it takes away from the president his ability to govern the foreign relations of this country. But I do believe that the president can do a lot, even within the confines of Helms-Burton. And I can't give you a statutory analysis. Maybe that's the thing to do, and give it to the president. Say, here are all the things you can do to move towards normalization of relationships between the two governments without violating Helms-Burton, because I believe that there's a lot that can be done. And I also believe that there are clauses in Helms-Burton that are emergency national security, national crisis clauses that give the president, under certain circumstances, that kind of latitude that he could invoke. Now, if you want me to do a special analysis of how we could do it within the context of, as the White House counsel of the President of the United States, giving him how do you do this within the context of not repealing, that would be a great assignment.
I was just suggesting that he say that the embargo is a failure. Say that publicly as president.
Well, yeah, he should say
I
it.
respect the law, but the law is a mistake, and I
But
call on Congress to make some changes.
the embargo did precede Helms-Burton. It's a 50-year, it's not just Helms-Burton. It's the embargo, yeah.
Phil Peters from the Cuba Research Center has a comment on Helms-Burton's side.
I just want to clarify, this is a little weird, Greg, because you're the lawyer and I'm not, but I've spent time looking at exactly that issue of the president's discretion. And I've found a whole bunch of analyses. Gail cited one, written by lawyers at great length, and they all come to the same conclusion, that the president has ample authority to lift all kinds of restrictions under the embargo, even under Helms-Burton, and to authorize even the import and export of goods and services. And you can find no study by any lawyer taking the contrary position. And the reason is simple, is because the people who wrote Helms-Burton blundered in the sense that they codified the embargo, they codified the body of regulations that comprise the embargo, the Cuban Assets Control Regulation.
Yeah.
And the very first phrase in that set of regulations says that all the following is prohibited except to the extent to which the president uses his licensing authority to permit. So they codified all the restrictions. But
And
they also
preserved his licensing
codified
authority.
the president's authority to modify the regulations. And that's why every president since Helms-Burton was passed has exercised that authority, even Bush, in both directions, Bush the second. And so there's no doubt, he can't lift the entire embargo, that's clear. But there's no doubt that he has ample authority to authorize trade in both directions of goods and services. Nobody disagrees with that.
What he said.
Okay, thanks. Orlando. Very briefly.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Very briefly. Only to mention one fact that hasn't been mentioned. As a Cuban, maybe I should remain silent, but I will make this favor to America. There is a legal demand established by the Cuban government in Cuban tribunals that is claiming for damages of human, economical, and all the disaster created by embargo in Cuba of $121 billion that America should pay as soon as it is possible or is not legislated the sanctions in American law. That has to be, that's a measure of force for the Cuban government to negotiate at some point. But so the balance, once that America acts unilaterally in order to preserve American interest, the balance in the other side, it takes two for a tango, will be 121 billion immediately. It's established in 2000, it was established. So it needs to be negotiated, that debt contracted already with my people, with my government, with the institutions of my country. So I know that the gross domestic product of USA is around 16,100 billion in a year, so maybe it's not too much money but it's something to be taken into consideration, no? That negotiation.
That is exactly why I take the position that the United States should not rely on a successful negotiation with Cuba to change its policy towards Cuba, because the future of U.S. interests should not be left up to the Cubans to decide. Now, it may well be that the Cubans have a good claim against the United States, and they should make it, and the government of the United States should respond to it. But we should not wait to change our policy towards Cuba until that's resolved. That is the formula for paralysis. It's actually, we've been very successful over 50 years, finding one reason after another to avoid doing what we have to do, what the government of the United States should have done many, many years ago.
Greg, let me ask you one last thing before we close out. I find myself thinking a little bit of Northern Ireland, a seemingly intractable, very emotional conflict, which the Clinton administration was able to play a critical role in resolving, and other seemingly intractable situations. You've now watched a couple of administrations sometimes act boldly and sometimes not have the courage of their convictions. What, in your sense, what has made the difference? The times that you've seen this administration or the Clinton administration close up really do the smart thing and the right thing, what has driven it? And the times that courage finally has failed at the last minute, what has been responsible there?
Well, in my experience, there's probably 3 or 4 things that have defeated the ability to reform our policy, not least of which is domestic politics. The significance of Florida as a swing state. Even today, you can imagine a Republican president winning the election in 2016 because he was able to take Ohio and Florida. Those are the 2 states that influence the outcome of presidential elections today. And those are the 2 states that are very narrowly on the margin. So what happens in Florida is important to the future of the country, and that population of Cuban-American voters becomes all that more strategically important because of the importance of Florida. What I think has changed is that population of Cuban voters has gotten younger. If you look at the recent polls, look, President Obama got 50% of the Cuban-American vote in 2012. That's unprecedented for a Democrat. Now, I'm not sure that can be replicated, but I think what's happened is that the domestic politics have become somewhat more welcoming to normalization of relations with Cuba than they were even 8 years ago.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much.